On this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be going over NFL bets for Week 9, and I'm also going to review Week 8, as well as go over my season record prior to either of those other two things. I'm also going to touch up on the U.S. presidential election and what bets were made prior to that. But before any of that, here's a quick reminder to set aside a percentage of your winnings or remaining money to donate to one of the many good causes out there. Donating will swing you on the right side of variance, whether you win or lose. I will have a couple of charities linked in the description in case you're interested. And of course, there's many other good causes out there. Just to be clear, I'm recording this on November 5th, 2020. It's about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Really quick before I go into the recap of Week 8 and dive into Week 9 bets, I'm going to go over some qualifiers for first-time listeners. I don't consider myself a sharp bettor yet, but I do typically outperform the market in predicting NFL games. I've been predicting NFL games straight up since I was very young in 2012, and from the years 2012 to 2019, I'm at approximately 63% straight up. In 2020, my record on straight-up games, just predicting the winner, is 81-37-1. 68.6% correctness rate puts me in the 96th percentile on ESPN. 2019 was my first year predicting spreads for every NFL game. Last year, I was around 53.4% for all games, put me in around the 90th percentile on ESPN, which, again, that percentile is fluky for several different reasons. So far in 2020, my registered record is 67-49-3. I'm at around 57.8%, 97th percentile on ESPN. So keep in mind that my percentile is inflated slightly in both years. Basically, sharp bettors are not included in the sample of ESPN participants. And in addition to that, the lines tend to not move on ESPN.com, so a lot of times I'll get tremendous line value based on movement that happens later in the week. I would say the pool of ESPN participants are generally kind of a right-tailed distribution of participants. For example, in 2019, 53.4% should have probably been more realistically around the 70th percentile rather than the 90th, and this year in 2020 as well. Despite being at 57.8%, I think that I'm probably in a higher percentile than I otherwise should be. Some additional records to go over for 2020. My record on teasers so far this year is 10-6-1. I personally play on a sportsbook where ties end up as pushes, where the player gets their money returned to them. Some cases there are books that count pushes as losses. My record on game totals so far, only 8-6. I have not done as many bets on totals yet this year. And parlays, well, I don't really bet on parlays because they tend to be one of the least probabilistic things for the player. The odds tend to be stacked up against the player far more than they realize, and I tend not to do player props yet either, as that's still something I am learning. So now I'm done with qualifiers, and I will get into the Week 8 recap. So now I'm going to do a recap of last week, which is Week 8 of the NFL season. I always find it as a beneficial thing to do to go back and look at where things went correctly and where things went incorrectly, to recap wagers, to get a feel for patterns and some incorrect assumptions that were made along the way. So I think in terms of success rate, Week 8 was probably my most successful betting week of the NFL season. It was a really big teaser week, and look, I'm probably bound for some regression at some point, but all of the teasers from last week ended up hitting, and in addition to that, there was a plus record on the other bets as well. What I've found is that the trick with teasers is to find low total games where you can take the desired team through either the numbers 3 and 7 or 7 and 10. That goes for favorites or for underdogs. And so there were four major teaser legs that I had last week. Pittsburgh against Baltimore, took them from +4 to +10.5. Chicago against New Orleans, taking them from +4.5 out to +10.5. Miami against the Rams, I took from +4 out to +10.5. And New England against Buffalo from +3.5 out to +9.5. And the totals for those games, respectively, in order: 46.5, 44.5 for the Bears-Saints game, but that one moved down to 41. For the Dolphins-Rams game, started at 46, moved down to 45.5. And for that New England-Buffalo game, it was around 43 by the end of it. So all those games relatively low totals, and that is what made them perfect teaser opportunities, especially when you get the underdog team teased out. In most of those cases, through the numbers 7 and 10, or in New England's case, you get them out to 9.5. Some other bets that were successful from last week: Miami's money line at +150 against the Rams. This was a really important game from a betting angle, I thought, because there were so many little things working against the Rams that I think ultimately were not trivial. The Rams going from West Coast to East Coast, coming off of a Monday Night Football game, coming off of a really big victory against, a team they were competing with, I guess, in the NFC. Ultimately, all of those little things kind of added up, and it was kind of a good spot to take Miami, I thought. And frankly, Miami actually got a little bit lucky in that game. A bunch of very low probability plays ended up happening: punt return, fumble return for a touchdown, etc. So the turnovers really favored Miami in that game, and they were definitely on the right side of variance. I liked the Colts at -2.5 against Detroit. It was a little bit of a hedge for me because I had no bets on Indianapolis going into the season, but I did like Detroit over 6.5 wins. So with that in mind, I thought, well, Frank Reich coming off of a bye, this is a good spot to hedge against the Detroit Lions, who seem to look horrible every other week under Matt Patricia. I took the Las Vegas Raiders money line as well. +115 early in the week. That moved out to even money by the end of the week. This was also a hedge. I had the Raiders under 7.5 wins going into the year. I had the Browns over 8.5 wins going into the year. I think the bet also made sense from like a spot perspective, just because I don't think Cleveland's been that good this year. They beat Cincinnati twice, they beat Washington. I don't think they've looked particularly good in a game start to finish against a good team this year. The Colts game was a little bit sloppy. They looked horrible against Pittsburgh, horrible against Baltimore. I think despite the win-loss record, the Browns are a little bit fraudulent. I don't think they're a bad team, but to me, they're right around in the average range, right with the Raiders as well. And, heading into last week, I think you could say pretty definitively, as much as it has surprised me, but Derek Carr has been better than Baker Mayfield so far this year. So anyway, there were a few spot things that also made sense for the Raiders in that game. I took Minnesota +7 early in the week before that number went down to around 5.5 by the end of the week against Green Bay. This was also a little bit of a hedge. I have a lot on Green Bay winning the NFC North. I have a lot on the Vikings under 9, and so I thought this was a good spot. Kirk Cousins also, in his career, despite being bad against good teams, he's actually played some of his best games against the Green Bay Packers. For whatever reason, he's had a very good track record against Green Bay, and I figured it would continue in this game. Not exactly. Dalvin Cook really took the game over himself, but I think that Minnesota was getting too many points, I thought, in a game that appeared to be a little bit closer than what the markets indicated. Two totals ended up hitting: Denver Chargers over 44.5. I just thought Herbert seems to be a guy where his games are playing over for the most part, and I just didn't really think that line made a lot of sense. There was good weather in the game, and nothing really, made me feel like the game would play that far under. In New Orleans, Chicago, over 41. That was very close to kickoff. This game went from around 44.5 at the beginning of the week down to 41 by kickoff. I looked at weather reports for Chicago before the game, and it was generally clear. I didn't really understand why this line was moving down. Based on the line movement, I thought there was some kind of snowstorm coming, but there just wasn't. And Chicago, New Orleans ended up going over that total, going to overtime. Now moving on to the bets that failed from last week. I liked Tennessee at -5.5 early in the week against Cincinnati before that line got all the way out to -7. I also liked Cincinnati to go over 54. That was also a total that was earlier in the week. That total went down as the week went by, probably around, I think, 51 by kickoff, so I did not get the best of that number, and it went under anyway. I liked San Francisco +3 against Seattle. Again, for me, that was a little bit of a hedge because before the season started, San Francisco under 10.5 was one of my biggest plays, and in addition to that, I have a lot of Seahawks futures on their Super Bowl odds to win the Super Bowl, to go to the Super Bowl, Russell Wilson to win MVP. I have over 9.5 wins for the Seattle Seahawks, and also invested quite a few times in them to win the NFC West. And then finally, a bet that did not work out. I thought Tampa Bay would win big against the Giants, and I was wrong. I had them -10.5 early in the week before the line got out to 12. That was one where I probably just overlooked, I probably overlooked the fact that I was giving away a lot of key numbers with 3, 7, and 10. But anyway, was not one of my favorite bets of last week. There's actually one bet that I left out from week 8. I think I'm going to throw the U.S. presidential election wagers in the week 8 slate of bets. So 2020 has been one of the most chaotic years in recent history for a lot of different reasons. The 2020 U.S. presidential election is coming down to every single vote that's coming in. It is one of the closest elections in the history of the United States. So I bet on Trump +150 to win the presidential election, to become reelected. I also bet on the Republicans to win Arizona at even money, the Republicans to win North Carolina at even money, and the Republicans to win Ohio a little over 3-1. And this presidential election has some interesting aspects to it. At least on the site that I was on, Biden was -200 and Trump was at +150. Despite that, this betting site had Arizona and North Carolina as essentially coin flips. Both were very close to even money. But of course, this betting site had Ohio over 3-1, and it had all of the following states at nearly 2-1 odds in favor of Republicans: Florida, Georgia, Texas, and Pennsylvania, all nearly 2-1 on this betting site. So it makes you wonder, if you go through and count every state and you look at who's favored and just give it to the side that was favored on this betting site, it basically had the Republicans taking, the majority of the electoral points at this point. So it basically had Trump as favored to win, but yet not favored to win on the actual election bet. He was at +150, as I mentioned. This is one of the rare cases where sportsbooks wanted a non-50-50 split on the betting markets. The reason for this is probably because of all of the media and propaganda in favor of Biden leading up to the election, which kind of, I think, made the average, public supporter more keen on the idea that Trump was probably the wrong side of the bet just because of all of this media coverage that was against him. When in reality, I think that Trump ended up being the sharp side of this election from a betting angle, just because if you go through all the states, he was projected to win on most betting sites, which was a really specific thing that they did, and yet he was at least for me, +150 to win the presidential election. Obviously, there's still a lot that's been yet to be determined, but I think that the fact that it's really come down to about a coin flip at this point. I'm recording this, by the way, November 5th, 2020. It's about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The fact that it's gotten down to about a coin flip, to me, is already a victory, not just from a betting angle, but also, personally, I think that Trump losing the election narrowly is going to have some negative ramifications on a lot of different aspects of life. I think that people are going to lose a lot more than just the money that they lost betting on Trump if Trump ends up losing this election narrowly. Basically, I think the far left continues to push their extremist and rather concerning agenda through their puppet, Joe Biden. And the things that I think are most concerning at this point is that I think the First and Second Amendments are potentially going to be shattered in the next few years if Trump doesn't get reelected right now. And in addition to that, specifically pertaining to the First Amendment, I think that a lot of the biggest tech companies are kind of in favor of filtering out any information that doesn't coincide with the far left's agenda, essentially. So, sooner rather than later, some of these really large tech companies might be able to just completely filter out whatever they want, and ultimately the media is going to turn into just a wave of propaganda that kind of pushes people in a direction that they might not realize they're going in until it's too late. So for a lot of different reasons, I think those are the most, concerning and specific ones for now. But for a lot of different reasons, I think people are going to lose a lot more than just the money they bet on Trump if Trump happens to narrowly lose this election. But I digress. So now I'm going to transition over to the Week 9 slate of NFL games. So again, this is probably not going to be produced until after the Thursday night game happens, but it doesn't really matter because I don't have any feel for what a good, efficient side would be anyway. San Francisco is catching 7 points at home. The total for this game is now 48.5. I wanted to go over really quickly the long list of San Francisco 49ers players that are currently injured. The list of players that are noteworthy for the 49ers who won't be playing in this Thursday night game: Jimmy Garoppolo, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Kendrick Bourne, Trent Williams, Weston Richburg, Jordan Reed, Raheem Mostert, Tevin Coleman, Jeff Wilson Jr., Jalen Hurd, Richard Sherman, Nick Bosa, Solomon Thomas, Dee Ford, and Ziggy Ansah. I think the 49ers are historically decimated at this point. I can't remember a team that's been this decimated by injuries. So anyway, this Thursday night game for me is a no play. Might be interesting to watch. Now for the Sunday early games. Atlanta 4-point favorites at home against Denver. The total on this game is 50. I'm completely laying off of it. I feel like Atlanta has been a tricky team to figure out, and Denver, quite frankly, has been as well. I think Drew Lock has been one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL, and yet the Broncos are actually 3-4, and they've looked okay in a couple of their games, so this is a no play for me. I do like Seattle-Buffalo, though. I think Seattle being 2.5-point favorites on the road, that's a short road favorite that I want to take. Again, I think Russell Wilson is potentially the best quarterback in the NFL, and if Wilson is getting less than a field goal as a favorite against Josh Allen, I'm going to side with the team that Russell Wilson is on. Plus, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are, potentially is the best receiver duo in the NFL right now. I think Seattle's defense is, pretty bad, but I think it's similarly poor to Buffalo's defense. Seattle's defense, I think, could end up regressing to the mean similarly to how Kansas City's defense regressed towards the end of the 2019 season. One big step in the right direction for the Seahawks is that Jamal Adams is questionable for this game. Chicago is at Tennessee. The Titans are 6-point favorites at home. The total on this game is 46.5. I like the over for this game. I don't particularly like either side of the spread, but Tennessee's offense has been one of the best in the NFL dating back to last year. If you just look at 2019 and beyond, Ryan Tannehill is like the 5th or 6th best quarterback in the league. A.J. Brown is, to me, a top 10 receiver in the NFL. They have good supporting cast members. I like Corey Davis. I like Jonnu Smith. I don't think Tennessee's defense is any good, but that plays into the over for this game. I think Chicago can score enough points for this game to creep over 46.5. Baltimore is at Indianapolis. The Colts are 2.5-point underdogs at home. The total on this game is 47. This line has moved from Baltimore minus 3.5 down to Baltimore minus 2.5. I think the reason why is because Marlon Humphrey and Patrick Queen are both out for this game with COVID, but this is a spot where I like Baltimore. And, part of this is a hedge because I've been betting against Baltimore all season long. It started before the season started with Baltimore under 11.5 wins. I also bet on Kansas City to win the Super Bowl, to win the AFC, which was a fading of Baltimore as well. And I've bet against Baltimore in the big games, when they played Kansas City, when they played Pittsburgh. I'm at a point now, though, where I think they're getting slightly underrated by the market. 2.5 points is a pretty low amount for them to cover. They have actually won games at a very high percentage, despite my fading of them. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a pretty critical game for their season-long win total. So I'm going to go with Baltimore to cover 2.5, but I feel like this is a hedge that makes a lot of sense. Carolina is at Kansas City. The Chiefs are favored by 11 points at home, 10.5 points in other places. The total on this game, 51.5. I like the over just because Patrick Mahomes is involved, and I think that the only way this game goes under is if the game script for Kansas City plays to like a slower pace where they run the ball more, but I'll take my chances with Mahomes going over. Detroit is at Minnesota. This line is no longer up. It was previously at -4 in favor of Minnesota at home. Matthew Stafford is now on the COVID list, so it's going to be basically a no play until a line comes out. The Giants are at Washington. Washington, 3-point favorites at home. So this is a game that I like a lot. The total's only 41.5. Low total means that I am immediately thinking about a teaser. I like the Giants getting pushed from +3 out to +9. Daniel Jones is 3-0 in his career against Washington, and he's had a couple of his best games against the Washington football team. So this is one half of a teaser lag that I will mention later. This is also a little bit of a hedge for me. I had Washington over 5 wins before the season started, and a couple weeks ago when Dak Prescott got injured, I invested heavily in Washington 10-1 to win the NFC East. I just thought it was a mispricing, just considering that the Eagles aren't any good, and I wanted to fade Dallas without Dak Prescott. All right, the final early game this week is Houston at Jacksonville. The Jaguars are 7-point underdogs at home. The total is 51. The Jags are starting Jake Luton at quarterback, brand new rookie quarterback, 6th-round pick. I don't want to go anywhere near this game because I don't trust Jacksonville to cover 7 points, and I have a hard time asking Houston to do anything betting-wise. The Texans are a team that I've avoided all year for good reasons. I guess 2 weeks ago, one of my more memorable losses was taking Houston money line against Tennessee, and unfortunately it failed in overtime with Derrick Henry rumbling into the end zone. But yeah, Houston's a team that I just can't trust to cover a spread, to go over a total, to do really just about anything at this point. All right, moving on to the evening games here. Chargers are hosting the Raiders. Very short geographical trip here for the Raiders. This game has turned into a pick'em. It started out as Chargers -1.5. Total on the game is 52.5. So going into the 2020 season, I had under 7.5 wins for both of these teams, but I had a lot more on the Chargers. So for me, this is a little bit of a hedge. I'm just going to take the Chargers in a pick'em situation to win the game outright. I think it's fair to say Herbert's, maybe a better quarterback than Derek Carr, or at least he has some more variance associated with his game, a little bit more upside. And so I'll have fun taking the Chargers this week, and hopefully they end up losing so that season win total continues to stay down. Pittsburgh is at the Cowboys. Dallas is receiving 14 points at home. The total is 42. Normally, I would say this is a teaser opportunity because of the low total and the large spread, but I'm not going anywhere near this game. I don't particularly trust Pittsburgh to cover 14 points. I think on the down low, their offense has actually not been all that efficient. Roethlisberger is not somebody who I trust as much as some of the other quarterbacks in the AFC. And I think if you're backing Dallas at this point, you are out of your mind. So I'm laying off of that game. The final evening game is Miami at Arizona. Cardinals, 4.5-point favorites at home. This line has gone from 5 to 4.5. Total is 48. To me, this game is in the dead zone. I'm not going to touch it. Miami rewarded me last week, but they did get a little bit lucky with the punt return and the fumble return for touchdowns. Tua didn't look that great to me, even though I had really high priors on him. I didn't really feel that impressed when I watched him last week. Miami generated very little offense, and so considering that, I don't really want to invest in Miami, even though my instinct is telling me that they're the right side in this case, because Arizona has really not been overly impressive consistently either. But both these teams are decent, and it's kind of a unique situation here. With them playing each other. All right, for Sunday Night Football, the Saints are at the Bucs. Tampa Bay has fluctuated a little bit. They started out as 4.5-point favorites. The line jumped out to 5.5. Now I see it back down at 3.5. The total on this game, 51.5. I kind of like Tampa Bay to win outright in this game, so I think that I would pay a premium maybe at minus 130 to get Tampa Bay minus 3. I think this is a tricky matchup for the Saints. I do not like the fact that Drew Brees doesn't throw the ball downfield. I think Tampa Bay's defense is a lot worse off when they're challenged with deep passes, similarly to what Daniel Jones did on Monday night. Daniel Jones wasn't afraid to attack them downfield. Drew Brees won't be doing that. And so with that in mind, I think the Bucs corners are going to be able to play very physically, within the 5 yards or whatever. They're going to be able to jump routes. It's unclear if Michael Thomas is actually going to play in this game, but we do know that Antonio Brown is back for Tampa Bay. I don't think Chris Godwin is in for Tampa Bay. But this is a big game, for both teams. This is really a battle for the NFC South. Tampa Bay lost to New Orleans week 1, so if the Saints win this game, they will take control of the division and probably have to be favored because they're 2-0 against the Bucs. My only issue is that I think the Saints have been unimpressive in most of the games this season after week 1. All right, and finally, Monday Night Football, the Jets host the Patriots. The Jets are catching 7 points at home. Total is 42.5. So this is the other side of the teaser that I referenced earlier, with the Giants being pushed out from +3 to +9. I like the Patriots getting from -7 down to -1. New England isn't particularly good. They don't have good receivers. I have major questions about Cam Newton at this point as a passer. But it's the Jets who are terrible. And the one really important thing we found out about the New England Patriots in Week 8, they competed with Buffalo. They almost won the game outright. They're trying. They're not tanking quite yet. It looks like they're at least playing the games to win. They didn't trade Stephon Gilmore at the deadline. They didn't trade Joe Thuney at the deadline. They didn't trade Julian Edelman. They actually picked up a receiver from Miami, Isaiah Ford, and they also picked up Dante Pettis off of waivers. New England is still playing to compete in 2020.